My children Sam and Robbie are twin 6-year-olds. A year ago, we were forced to move out of our old house due to unforeseen circumstances. It is an extremely long and horrible story. We lived in the old house for 4 whole years. During that time, I married my wife Carol, and also our home became the birthplace of our children. Unfortunately, our neighborhood began to gradually deteriorate. Despite this, we always intended to stay in this house in the near future until something unforeseen happened. We lived in a corner house, and the house behind ours was surrounded by thick trees and shrubbery, so we almost never noticed our neighbors. However, our neighbor to the right was named Steve. He moved here less than a year ago. I only had a couple conversations with him. Because of his strong accent, I had a hard time understanding what he was saying, and overall he did not give the impression of being a friendly person. He had 2 windows facing the backyard, but I never saw a light on in them at any time of the day or night. I thought it was a room designated for guests or something like that. One summer, Sam and Robbie were playing in the backyard in the inflatable pool and with water pistols while I was doing yard work. At one point, as I was walking toward the detached garage, I briefly saw Steve through his window in the neighboring house. After a few seconds of noticing him, he turned around and disappeared from view. This struck me as a bit odd, but I disregarded the remark. Later that day, as the sun began to set, the children went outside again to play. The weather was very hot, so they went back to their inflatable pool while I stayed in the kitchen making dinner. A while later, the kids were quiet, and suddenly Robbie came into the house and reported that there was a light flashing in the neighbor's window. Robbie and I went out to the backyard, and I pointed to one of the windows at the top of Steve's house that faced the backyard, and he said that the light was coming through from that window all the time. Instantly, I had a worst guess and asked the twins if it was a camera flash. Both replied that it was. I told them to go back inside. I helped them wipe themselves off, and then Carol and I discussed the case. We immediately suspected the worst. Carol said I should go next door and knock on Steve's door. I did so, but he didn't answer the door. He had his car in the driveway, so it was assumed he must have been home. After several unsuccessful attempts to knock and ring, I decided to go home. I told Carol that our neighbor wasn't answering the door, and that just backed up what the kids were saying, even though we had no proof that the white light the kids saw was a camera flash. But it was very much like her, and that was alarming. One night when Carol and I were in the bedroom, we heard a gate quietly opening and closing outside. Carol asked me to check to see what was wrong. I went out to the backyard and looked around. Turning on all the flashlights, I started looking but found nothing and no one. However, I did notice a light on in Steve's backyard. I walked over to the fence and peered into his yard. I was almost immediately overcome with panic when he came up on the other side and asked if I needed help. I asked him if he had seen anyone sneaking through our yard. He answered in the negative. I also asked him if he noticed someone watching my kids when they were playing in the pool. His response was suspicious. He took offense to my question and even started snapping at me for this accusation. I had no proof and didn't want to cause problems with my neighbor, so I apologized and went back into the house. Carol was not happy, calling him a rude person. The next incident happened a few weeks later when we were all asleep. I woke up to Carol's panicked scream shaking me. I looked around the room, a little confused. But as soon as I heard the children's screams from their room, I leaped out of bed and ran down the stairs to the children's room. Roddy woke up crying, and Sammy echoed his cries with his scream. Roddy said there was someone at the window a moment ago, and then there was a flash of a camera. My goosebumps ran, and my blood boiled at the same time. I asked what he looked like. Roddy replied that he couldn't see. I took the kids up to our room to sleep next to us. Turning off the light, I looked out of our bedroom window, directing my gaze to Steve's dark house. I looked around every window of his house and spotted him. He, like me, was peeking through an upstairs window in a room overlooking the backyard. I ran outside and knocked on his door several times. He never opened it. I called the police and left a report on Steve. If there are reports from other people in the future, maybe the police will look into it. I never saw him again. Sometimes I would sit near the entrance hoping he would come out, but he always avoided when I was around. So after a month, we moved to a new house in another city. It turned out to be the best place to raise children. I share an apartment with my roommate, whose name is Sarah. We are cozy and have established a comfortable routine. I was 31 years old at the time, and although most people at that age are on their own, I liked living with my roommate. We've known each other since our college days, and our personalities complement each other perfectly. We have a 2-bedroom apartment and a nice house, and Sarah and I have grown accustomed to this day-to-day life, doing our own thing, taking casual walks and enjoying each other's company. One night, however, turned our perception of the safety of our home upside down. I remember that night as if it were yesterday, even though it had been over 5 years. It was a normal Thursday night, and we decided to finish watching our favorite TV shows. We settled down on the couch with some goodies, chatting about our day and sharing silly gossip. It was such a relaxing evening that we looked forward to a restful night's sleep. When the clock struck midnight, we decided to call it a night. I went to my room, Sarah to her room. I changed into some comfortable clothes and got into bed. Just as I was about to close my eyes, I thought I heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I figured it was probably Sarah going to get a glass of water or something. But the footsteps didn't stop on her side of the room. They kept moving towards my bedroom. Excitement mixed with fear, and I strained to listen to the sounds. The door to my room opened slowly, creaking, and my heart thumped harder. Before I could react, the darkness was broken by Sarah's voice. "Someone's here," she whispered, and her voice sounded trembling. I jumped up from the bed and glanced at the doorway. There was a man standing in the hallway. He was tall with a disheveled look. I recognized him. I had seen him in this house. He was one of our neighbors. My breath caught as I tried to realize what was happening. At that moment, I slammed the door shut and blocked it with my body. Then I heard footsteps again. He was coming after me. He started banging on the door and trying to open it. I yelled to Sarah to call the police. Then I heard her yelling for the man to leave because the police were on their way. The banging continued for another 10 seconds, then stopped. At that point, I heard the man walking away. When the police finally arrived, we told them everything. We said it was one of our neighbors, but we weren't sure which apartment he lived in. From the description we gave them, they were able to track him down and arrest him. We never found out what he wanted, but I think it's safe to say the guy was not right in the head. I learned 2 lessons from that experience. The first is to never live alone, and the second is to always lock your damn doors. When I was about 10 years old, we lived next door to a mysterious woman. She had an exceptional appearance. Her long black hair and pale skin only added to her mystery. She rarely left her house, so we simply nicknamed her Vampire Lady. No one even knew her name. She was so secretive. However, when someone passed by her house, she would always look at them. I could hardly believe my mom's stories or my brother's stories. It sounded too unreal. But one day, when my friend Jess came to visit, I decided to tell her about the mysterious woman across the street. Jess, like me, was curious and suggested to me that at night, when everyone was asleep, we go inside her house and see what was going on. Even though I had my doubts, I agreed. We knew we had to be incredibly careful not to wake my mom. Terrified, I realized that at my age, going outside in the dark was strictly forbidden, but still bravely decided to try and walk out of the house, holding hands and trying not to make a sound. Now the only thing in front of us was to cross the street to reach the house of the mysterious woman. All inside peered hopefully through the windows, and at last Jess grasped my hand and whispered quietly but insistently, "Let's go. Let's go." "What?" "We just got here. What happened?" I asked, as Jess pulled me along and we walked back down across the street. The door slammed shut, and Jess said as she looked out the window and saw something that looked very much like a video camera that showed a small flashing light. I offered to block out the event and just go to bed discussing everything in the morning. But unfortunately, the story didn't end there. As the clock on the wall showed 3 in the morning, Jess suddenly started screaming. I quickly climbed up on the bunk bed to see what was going on and saw a camera lens pointed directly at our bedroom window. My mom and brothers suddenly burst into my room, illuminating it with the lights on. This, of course, startled the person who was apparently filming everything on camera. To reassure her and tell her of my suspicions, I warned my mom that someone was watching us from the outside. After glancing around her room, my mom decided to go outside with bat in hand and survey the neighborhood. She wandered around for a few minutes and then came back and asked us what the person watching us looked like. All my sister Jess and I could describe was the camera lens. We could see him just fine. Although we had no proof, we felt in our hearts that it was the woman from across the street. My mother was a little angry that we, while waiting for morning, told her how we guessed that the looks were coming from this woman. We were not allowed to go near her house after the incident, and to this day I still sometimes have bad dreams about the incident. I am 15 years old and my family and I have just moved into a new house. While unloading our belongings, I noticed that the neighbors were watching us from their homes. Following the family rule of being friendly, I waved to them as a greeting. However, I became uncomfortable when I saw that among them was a man in his 30s, and his smile grew wider when he noticed my waving. I went inside and looked around our new house. It was huge. When I got to my room, I noticed that it had a pretty good view of the front yard. The only thing was, people outside could look into my room too. My mom didn't like it, but I kept arguing with her until she agreed to let me keep the room. As summer vacation began, my mother kept urging me to go outside and play baseball. She really wanted me to enjoy the nice weather and make new friends in our neighborhood. So I decided to grab my baseball gear and headed outside to play with my brothers and dad. As I looked at the houses across the street from ours, I noticed an interesting guy. Although he looked a little strange, he wasn't accompanied by any company. I asked my dad if I could call him over to play with us. My dad, bent on trusting people, agreed and said, "Invite him." I walked across the street and approached this guy, asked his name, and he said his name was Austin. Asked if he wanted to join our baseball game, and Austin happily agreed, saying, "Sure, since you play." We had a great time playing together. When the game was over, Austin walked back to his house across the street, waving and smiling at me. The next day, my parents went to pack their things. Although I wasn't drawn to go with them, I decided to stay home and unpack my things in the quiet of my room. Suddenly, I remembered that I had forgotten to lock the door like my mom had told me to. As I was about to head to the living room, I heard the sound of the front door opening and closing. At first, I thought it might be Mom or Dad, and I was about to call out to them, but a strange feeling came over me. I realized with great amazement that it wasn't my parents, but Austin. He walked into the house and closed the door behind him. As soon as I noticed this, I got scared and ran to my room as fast as I could. I hid in my closet, still hearing his footsteps coming closer and closer. He entered my room, opened the dresser drawers, and started searching through them. Then he left the room and walked down the hallway. I looked out of the closet and saw my underwear scattered on the floor. Silently, I followed him down the hallway, hoping he wouldn't notice me. I really wished he would just go into another room. But instead, Austin turned around and opened the bathroom door, and I didn't know what he was looking for in there. Once the hallway was clear, I didn't waste another minute and ran out the front door as fast as I could. Then I hurried to the neighbor's house nearby. I was so scared. When I got there, I cried and told them everything that had happened. They were very sympathetic and immediately called the police. They kept me inside until the police arrived. The cops looked around the neighborhood, but they couldn't find Austin. I haven't seen him again since. This happened in my former apartment where I lived from June 2021 until I moved in 2 years later. About a year after I moved in, a new tenant moved into the neighboring apartment. My apartment was on the second floor, the penultimate apartment at the end of the building. The layout was straight hallways with rooms on either side. My apartment consisted of a bedroom, 1.5 bathrooms, a living room, and a kitchen. During my time living here, most of the neighbors were friendly, and I got to know many of them on the floor. The previous neighbor next to me was friendly, but the new neighbor seemed less outgoing. After a brief conversation, I rarely saw him. About 6 months after he moved in, I was disturbed late one night by knocks coming from the side of his wall. At first, I didn't pay attention to it, thinking it was due to renovation work. The next night, however, the noise continued and became noticeably louder. Despite this, I managed to fall asleep. The next night, I woke up in the middle of the night to sounds coming from the bathroom connected to the bedroom. The room was dark, and I couldn't make out anything. Even though I was sure I had locked the doors, I heard footsteps and grabbed my phone and keys and ran out of the apartment. I ran down the hallway, down the stairs, and finally made it to my car. I called my best friend, who let me spend the night at her place. The next day, we went back to my apartment to look everything over. To my surprise, nothing scary had happened. No one was inside and nothing had been stolen. Confused and concerned, I told my friend what had happened. As we were looking around the bathroom, I noticed an oddity near the shower. After sending a picture for proof, I discovered a large closet or pantry next to the shower. Upon opening it, I saw several items that were out of place, and there was a noticeable crack in the wall. On the other side of the wall was my new neighbor. It became obvious that he had made a hole in the wall to get into my apartment. Terrified, we called the police and the building administration. The neighbor admitted his actions, but his intentions remained unknown. Fortunately, I did not have to endure his presence for long before the end of the rental period, and I decided to move out because of this frightening experience. I am grateful for the timely response that evening, which allowed me to leave the apartment quickly. A story about a former neighbor of mine makes my soul stand still. My wife, our dog Sparky, and I lived in a single-family home with 1 acre of land in a residential neighborhood. We had lived in that house for 5 years, but alas, our neighbor Ben has been an absolute nightmare since he moved in, which was about a year ago. He has torn up our flowers, criticized the car, and even called our house the ugliest on the block. However, his obnoxious behavior peaked when he started leaving his stuff, like an old canoe and a patio table on our property. I got sick of it and moved his stuff back into his yard, contemplating the possibility of installing a fence. But then a grim story happened out of the blue. Our beloved dog Sparky disappeared. We became increasingly worried, scouring the neighborhood for hours looking for him. Upon returning home, I thought I heard faint barking coming from Ben's backyard. Upon doing my own investigation, I discovered that Sparky was locked in the neighbor's shed. Unable to get him to open the door, I was forced to enlist the help of the police. Upon their arrival, Sparky was rescued and we filed charges against Ben. Although he was given a relatively light sentence along with probation, he had to leave our neighborhood. I am glad he is out of our lives and hope I never see him again. In 1984, when I was 11 years old, my single mother, 9-year-old sister, and 6-year-old brother moved into a beautiful craftsman-style house that I was told was about 80 years old. Shortly after we moved in, we discovered that the house was infested with cockroaches. I had never seen such a sight. When we turned on the lights at night, they scattered from every surface. We had to store all our food in the refrigerator except canned food. We tried insect bombs and professional exterminators many times, but they proved resistant. Apparently, these creatures could withstand even a nuclear war. In any case, it wasn't their fault that we didn't live in this house for a year before fleeing for our lives. I just thought it was an interesting side story. To this day, cockroaches top my list of most hated insects. I remember my mother talking to my grandmother about the neighbor's creepy son. He was in his 20s or 30s. One day when my grandmother was washing the dishes, she looked up and saw him standing on the other side of the kitchen window looking at her. Normally, she would have kept this horrible thing hidden from us children, but at the time she told us to tell her if we saw him anywhere near the house and we were not allowed to play outside. She also woke up a couple of times to find him standing on the bed, and once she put a cloth with chemicals on his face and knocked him out. This is the part of the story I know the least about because I heard it years later. Maybe he thought she was dreaming. I don't know if anything else happened. I didn't ask him in case something happened. It brought back some bad memories for me. One afternoon when we were all cleaning up, my brother said he found a cigarette butt in the upstairs bathroom. It was strange because no one in our family smoked. My brother, a stupid 6-year-old boy, flushed the butt down the toilet before telling my mother. I still remember my mother trying to get the whole story out of my brother, upset that the evidence had been lost and thinking that my brother was mistaken or had picked up a cigarette butt from somewhere outside out of curiosity. Soon she stopped talking about it, and we almost forgot about it. I think it was a few weeks after that. My brother was spending the night at our grandparents' house, and it was just my sister and I upstairs. My mother's bedroom was downstairs. My sister heard a sound like a door slamming, but she insisted she heard it from inside the house and panicked. I told my sister to go to bed because she had only heard the sound from outside. A minute later, a choking coughing sound was heard just outside the bedroom door. It was a man's cough, and he was trying not to make a sound. I whispered, "Let's go downstairs." We felt an irrational urge to sneak out of the room and turn on the light in the bathroom across the bedroom to see if anyone was there. I then felt a strong urge to get out of the bathroom and go downstairs immediately. The scariest moment of my life was when I crawled down the stairs in pitch darkness. It was a spiral staircase surrounded by walls, the perfect place for someone to hide. The lights were out, the wooden steps creaked, and I was afraid to go down. We went downstairs, woke up our mom, and told her in a panic that there was a man in the upstairs bathroom. My mom started to tell us to go back to bed, but she could see that we were really scared. Mom went under the stairs and told us that there was nothing to be afraid of. Then she thought to close and lock the door to the stairs. She did that and called the police, but they found nothing. The next day, she called a police detective, a friend from high school, to check the house. Remembering the cigarette butt in the bathroom, he asked her to look at the upstairs bathroom window. It was a long, narrow, rectangular window. It wasn't very big, but it was wide enough for a person to enter. How many times had intruders climbed through the roof and climbed upstairs while we slept on the other side of the hallway? The windows dangled on their hinges. When my mother's friend lowered the window, it sounded like a door slamming shut. She said we had to leave the house immediately because the locks on all the windows were old and useless. That day, we moved to my grandparents' house. A few days later, when my mother went with my brothers and sisters to pack our things, the back door was broken, but the house was empty. A few years later, I heard that the neighbor's son had been arrested for rape and attempted murder. I still wonder what would have happened if I had turned on the bathroom light, if my mother hadn't locked the staircase door, if we hadn't left when we left the house. I also wonder if the cockroaches still infest the house. Thanks for watching, my friend. I finally bought my first house when I was 28. It was in a rundown part of town, in a very unsafe area to live in. You definitely get what you pay for, and I learned my lesson. Nothing unusual happened in the first month I lived there, and I thought I was definitely getting used to it. You know what I mean? To live there. But that soon changed. We only had light conversations here and there with our neighbors, but nothing more than that. Despite the area we were in, surprisingly, everyone seemed quite normal. Of course, there was one oddball among the few. He lived a few houses down, in a rather small, run-down house. It was even more battered than the other houses, including mine. He was probably about 45 years old, and from the first time I saw him, he always creeped me out. He was of medium height, slightly overweight, had very little hair, and almost always wore the same dirty-looking clothes. He talked to me a lot, despite the fact that I was not really interested in him. On more than one occasion, I let him verbally abuse me. There was something very disturbing about him. For example, one time I was walking home from the grocery store and he was walking on the sidewalk towards my house. When I pulled into the driveway, he stopped, turned around, and started talking to me. He started talking about his dead mother, and how much he hated her and what a horrible woman she was. He seemed very angry and almost screamed as he told me these things. Another time, I was sitting on the porch with one of my friends, and he saw us sitting outside and invited himself in. He interrupted me while I was talking and started yelling about what happened at work. He was washing dishes in a restaurant, and he was telling us both how he hated it and wanted to leave. Then he started making racist remarks about some of the workers there. At this point, I didn't care to be polite anymore, and I went inside and signaled my friend Brendan to come with me. I closed and locked the door and looked out the living room window. Brendan and I were stunned by what had just happened, and started laughing uncontrollably at the strangeness of it all. Brendan had had too much to drink that night, and I thought it best to let him stay at my house. There was no bed in the guest room yet, so I let him sleep on the couch. In the middle of the night, as I was lying in bed, probably about to fall asleep, I heard a knock on the front door. I looked through the peephole and saw that it was a creepy man who wouldn't leave me alone. My instincts told me to ignore him, but my partner Brendan said so. I sighed, but the man looked troubled. His demands caught me completely off guard, and to be honest, pissed me off. He asked me for $50. I looked at him like he was crazy and said, "No, I don't have $50. He said okay and apologized for asking. I tried to close the door thinking it was over, but he reached out and put his arm through the door and leaned against it. "Wait, if you don't have any money, can you at least help me with something? Food, anything, a snack or something to get me through the rest of the night." I thought about helping him, but this guy was out of game and he didn't have much food anyway. It was 11 o'clock at night, and I was already quite uncomfortable with the situation, so I looked him in the eye, said categorically no, and told him to leave. I didn't feel any obligation to feed this man. If he didn't want to talk, I didn't have to talk to him. I was about to close the door again when he came in and grabbed me. Brendan immediately stood up and pulled him away from me. He must have realized he was outnumbered and couldn't win if he fought us. As he walked away, I saw that he was hiding a gun in his pants. Was this man going to attack me, or was he going to kill me? A few days later, when I told my neighbor about the incident, he was shocked. I told her about the man and the incident because she told me that no one lived in the house and that it had been abandoned a long time before she moved in, over 5 years ago at that point. When I called the police, they could not find anything to give me the slightest clue as to what happened inside or outside the house. I think there is no doubt in my mind that they were squatting to look for a place to live. To this day, I have never heard anything about what happened to me, and I cannot say with certainty what would have happened if I had been alone that night. I no longer live in that house, and it has been 3 years since I moved out. After moving from my home state to a new state 5 hours away from my university, I felt that the area around campus was not a safe place, so I made the decision that it would be best to find an apartment nearby to save money. When I got to the place, it looked like a large mansion that had been converted into a 3-story building, with a large 2-story portion added to the back. I decided to move into one of the middle apartments that was on the 2nd floor and had a parking space in the back of the building. At first, I was frustrated that I could see a distance from the other tenants, but over time, I got to know the people living in the apartment next door. They were a married couple with no children, probably 10-12 years older than me. The property manager explained to me that the husband was the son of the former owner of the entire building, but had been in a serious car accident by accident and had since had problems thinking and perceiving the world around him. The wife was friendly and had a strong and talkative personality. They both seemed very eager to get to know me and get to know me better, which was apparently driven by their own need for companionship. As time went on, it began to seem to me that they were seeking a special connection with me, and it gave me a strange feeling. They would often sit by their door or leave it partially ajar so that they could see me when I came or went from the apartment. Our interactions could last anywhere from 5 minutes to an hour and a half before they realized that I wanted to get on with things. Each time, they would invite me out for dinner or drinks, but I would graciously decline. What was even stranger was that despite their apparent friendliness, I could hear them yelling at each other. Sometimes these arguments would go on until the wee hours of the morning, preventing me from sleeping. I had to endure this for a whole year. In January, with only days left on my lease, I found a new place to live. However, during the move, her husband caught me carrying boxes. He called out to me, "Hey, where are you going?" I turned to face him but kept moving in the opposite direction and replied, "Oh, I'm actually going to move this week." His eyes widened and he just looked at me and said, "But you've never come over to my house for dinner." I didn't know what to say back except, "Yes, I wish we had that opportunity." He stood half-turned toward me and just stared at me. Turning around, I put the box in the car. As I drove out of the apartment complex, his eyes widened, but he only stared dumbly in my direction. After a while, I got rid of everything unnecessary and moved into the apartment, taking only the essentials with me. One night, the temperature dropped below zero. As the sun set, there was a power outage in the apartment. I couldn't get to the electric box, and when I called the person in charge of the building, he left me without an answer. I had to contact the electric company and inform them of the breakdown, after which I packed my things to spend time at my friend's parents' house. The next morning, I returned to move the last of my belongings. Noticing the electric company's truck parked in front of the house, I walked into my apartment. A worker approached me asking if I had called about an electrical problem. I confirmed my call. He laughed a little and stated, "You seem to have seriously pissed someone off." I asked who he was referring to, and he explained that the electrical problem was only in my apartment. Normally, when a problem occurs, the switch is in the middle position, but in my case, it was turned all the way up, meaning someone had deliberately turned off the electricity. The switch is in the basement, and only the building manager or owner can get there. I realized that my neighbor had deliberately deprived me of power on the coldest night of the year. It wasn't worth having a conversation with him about it. I just wanted to leave the place. Gathering my things, I left without even looking back to see if he or his wife were watching me. It was an ordinary evening when I first met our new neighbor, Mr. Reynolds. He had moved into the house next door, and my wife and I decided to show our hospitality and invite him over for dinner. We really wanted to make a good impression and get to know the man who would be living next door to us. Mr. Reynolds arrived quickly, and upon entering our home, he smiled warmly at us. This smile seemed rehearsed, as if he was hiding something. Throughout dinner, he was polite and engaged in conversation, but there was a strange emptiness in his eyes. They seemed bottomless, as if he was always distracted by something incomprehensible. Gradually, things became even stranger. Mr. Reynolds began asking personal and intrusive questions, inquiring into the details of our lives. We tried to turn the conversation to other topics, but he persisted in his interest in our personal lives. My wife and I exchanged anxious glances, feeling increasingly uncomfortable in his presence. When dinner was over, we politely asked Mr. Reynolds to leave, and only then did he leave our home. Before he left, however, he handed us a strange gift, an indoor plant. The gesture was unsettling, and I couldn't escape the feeling that he had put an implicit threat in that gift. In the days that followed, I constantly felt that Mr. Reynolds was watching us. I saw him outside my house, just standing there watching our dwelling. It gave me goosebumps running down my spine, and I became increasingly paranoid about our new neighbor. One night I was awakened by a knock on our bedroom window. Cautiously approaching the window, I saw Mr. Reynolds, his face pressed against the glass and his eyes staring intently at me. Trying to get him to leave, I yelled, but he wouldn't leave. He just kept staring, his breath fogging the window. This sinister act is vicious to me, for I felt violated in my own home. The next day, I decided to deal with Mr. Reynolds' behavior and knocked on his door. When he opened, I clearly told him that his actions were unacceptable and he should respect our personal space. However, his response was completely unexpected. Instead of apologizing or acknowledging his intrusiveness, he simply smiled his disturbing smile, stating that he wanted to be a good neighbor and get to know us better. I walked away from his door, feeling even more anxious than before. It was obvious that Mr. Reynolds was hiding something, and I didn't know how to deal with it. Weeks went by, and his behavior became more and more erratic. He would leave strange notes on our doorstep, with mysterious messages and drawings that made no sense. He seemed to be trying to convey some message to us, but I couldn't figure it out. One night we heard strange sounds coming from his house, whispering and mumbling as if people were gathered in it. It was well past midnight, and we realized that something was wrong. We called the police, and when they arrived, we found a room filled with pictures of our family, taken without our consent. Mr. Reynolds was taken into custody, and it was discovered that he had a previous history of stalking and harassment. We narrowly escaped the nightmare, and I couldn't help but wonder what might have happened if action hadn't been taken. To this day, I am still haunted by the memory of our chilling encounter with our new neighbor. It was an eerie reminder that danger can lurk very close, hidden behind a facade of politeness and ordinariness. Living in Dark Hollow, just a stone's throw from Pittsburgh, was controversial. The place was gorgeous, surrounded by expansive greenery and charming old houses. But heck, having neighbors in the form of the Wards was like living next to horror actors. They were the kind of people who could turn any ordinary day into an episode of The Twilight Zone. At the head of this family was Winston Ward, or Win, as he preferred to call himself. My interactions with Win were mostly during my teenage years. As a young girl, I received special attention from him, which I wasn't happy with. He was overly polite, but in a way that sent shivers down my spine. He seemed to be fake nice, always with some hidden agenda. There were times when I noticed his predatory glances on me, piercing and unadulterated. For example, one day when we happened to be in the same store, he followed me around, coming so close that it made me feel uncomfortable. He even sniffed the air next to me, which was very strange. I remember walking through the store trying to get rid of the unsettling feeling, but in the corner of my eyes I kept feeling his presence. Every time I turned a corner, I tried to get rid of it. But then, after a while, I walked out of the candy department, immersed in thinking about which candy to choose. I forgot about the time for a moment, but as I turned right at the end of the aisle, I almost shrieked in surprise. He was standing next to me, literally a couple feet away, and I was a little shorter than he was, so he seemed to be looking down on me with an unsettling smile on his face. He held his hand behind his back, and I noticed it move slightly. Then he spoke up. "Is this the sweetness you seek?" I was shocked, frozen in place as if rendered speechless. However, I remained polite, not wanting to cause a scene in the grocery store. I mumbled, "Thank you," and hurried away. I ran out of the store as fast as I could, not even daring to look back to see if he was following me. I was left with the feeling that I had just escaped the terrible danger that lurked in the shadows. Ward was strangely courteous to women and girls, but to guys he constituted a nightmare vision. My confrontation with my brother turned into a dangerous situation when his car was smashed with a baseball bat. Win was completely serious. Then a night happened that I still remember with trepidation. I was lying in my room trying to sleep when I heard strange noises outside my window. The shrill scratching was replaced by quiet tapping. At first I thought it was just a tree branch or something, but the sound was too rhythmic, too mysterious. I winced as I lay there listening to this horrible sound that grew more and more intense. Gathering my wits, I peered through the blinds, and what I saw pierced me to the marrow of my bones. A dark figure stood in the courtyard, moving as if seeking entrance. The moonlight was insufficient to discern who it was, but its shape it was too enormous to be an animal. My heart was pounding frantically, and I could hear it in my ears. I wanted to wail, calling my parents for help, but fear paralyzed me. The figure stood there for what seemed like an eternity, and then it just disappeared. The next morning I looked around the street, partially expecting to see footprints or something similar, but there was nothing. It seemed as if nothing had happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, that I was vulnerable in my own room. It was one of those moments that stayed with me, making me doubt every creak of the night house. and I certainly knew it was someone from the neighboring family. And that didn't strengthen my peace of mind. Then there was Maggie, Wynn's wife. She always wore lots of makeup and had dainty eyebrows. One day I stopped by to give them the mail that had been delivered to us by mistake, and she told me the scary origin story of the song, "Ring Around the Rosie." She seemed to enjoy scaring me. Their youngest son, Jacob, was very into Native American culture, but not in a good way. He ran around with a bow and arrow, and some people even claimed to have seen him with real arrows. Yes, he even scared people by showing up with dead animals. Plus, he even got the attention of social workers. Johnny, the eldest son, the ward, was not quite right. He was the kind of guy who growls at you in the hallways of the school like a wild animal. But the craziest thing he did was something to a girl from our school. She was beautiful and smart. Johnny had somehow unwisely fallen in love with her. He asked her out on a date, but when she turned him down, things went south. In chemistry class, he became sullen and silent while looking at her, to the point where she had to change lab partners. But Johnny didn't settle down. She was driving home from school one night, and in the rearview mirror she saw Johnny sitting in the back seat, grinning madly. He was hiding there, waiting for her. She was so scared that she lost control of the car and got into an accident, lying in the hospital for a week. And Johnny, he only got a slap on the wrist from the police. No serious consequences. It was crazy. When the for sale sign was finally put up on the ward's house, relief seemed to finally pass through Dark Hollow. After they were gone, they became more of an urban legend, a story that old-timers tell to scare their friends. It's nice to think that nothing terrible happened while they were here, but who knows what they're up to now? Wherever they are, it's scary to think about. Every time I walk to the store or down the street, I feel like they are still watching me. Even though nothing happened, that feeling never left me. It seemed like their presence left an indelible mark on the neighborhood. Sometimes I casually glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see their dark figures lurking in the shadows. It's a constant reminder of the anxiety they brought into our lives, a feeling that's hard to shake off. I hope to never have to run into this family again. Moving into a new house is always a rather nerve-wracking experience, but my fears were soon replaced by anxiety when I met our neighbor, Mrs. Simmons. She seemed friendly at first, but something about her gave me an inexplicable feeling. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, and she looked at me for too long. Mrs. Simmons was an elderly woman who had lived alone in the house next door for decades, and her neighbors always thought she was eccentric. Nevertheless, I tried to be a good neighbor and welcome her. But the first strange incident occurred when I was working in the yard. Mrs. Simmons appeared suddenly, her frail body just materialized by the fence. She looked at me with great interest and did not respond to my greeting. She just stood there and watched. Over the next few weeks, I noticed more oddities in her behavior. Mrs. Simmons spent many hours at the window looking out into our yard. At times, I found her standing in the dark in the middle of the night. It gave me the creeps. One night I decided to visit her and brought freshly baked cookies. I knocked on her door, but there was no answer. I figured she wasn't home, so I left the cookies on her doorstep with a note. The next morning the cookies were gone, but Mrs. Simmons was nowhere to be seen. I figured she liked it, but the uneasiness still remained. It seemed as if she never left the house during the day. One evening, while my wife and I were watching television, we heard a quiet, rhythmic tapping on our living room window. We jumped up and rushed to the window with aching hearts. There in the darkness stood Mrs. Simmons, her wrinkled face pressed against the glass and her eyes staring intently at us. I yelled for her to leave, but she didn't react. She just stood there, tapping her bony fingers on the window in a slow and deliberate rhythm. It resembled a scene from a horror movie. Out of fear, we called the police, who came to talk to Mrs. Simmons. She said she just wanted to meet her new neighbors, but I could see the fear in their eyes. They warned her to respect our personal space and to refuse further intrusions. Things were quiet for a while, and we hoped it was over. But one day a strange package appeared on our doorstep. Inside was a collection of old photographs. They were pictures of our home, of our family, taken without our consent. We realized with alarm that Mrs. Simmons had been spying on us for a long time. We felt hurt and unsafe in our own home. We called the police again, and they spoke to Mrs. Simmons again, this time sternly warning her of her actions. Months passed, and Mrs. Simmons became increasingly unapproachable. She rarely left the house, and if she did, it was in the evening, under cover of darkness. It seemed as if we were living next to a shadow, a presence that was always hidden and watching. We installed CCTV and took extra security measures, but the feeling of being watched never left us. Our once idyllic new home became a nightmare, overshadowed by a strange and disturbing neighbor. Eventually, Mrs. Simmons died, and the house remained empty for a long time. Everyone in the neighborhood breathed a sigh of relief, but memories of her frightening presence still haunted us. Meeting Mrs. Simmons taught us that sometimes the scariest things can happen in the most ordinary places, and that even behind the facade of ordinariness, there can be darkness